Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidil Anbiya'i wal Mursaleen. Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa atba'ihi ajma'in. It's good to be back with you all for our now annual Al-Ghazali weekend. And it's our custom to taste a few drops from the ocean of the Ihya al-Din, which is regarded, at least by the scholars of Islam, as the greatest work of our greatest scholar. And since Islam is the greatest of the monotheisms, that makes it a very important book indeed. And one of the things we might be doing as we ponder the book is to see exactly why it should have been given this unique accolade. This is a Ghazali retreat, which means not just that we sit and scratch out a few notes during not terribly frequent lectures, but that inshallah we will be living the kind of life which Imam al-Ghazali rahmatullahi alayh would have wished us to adhere to in a place such as this. This is not a vacation site, this is not a resort. This is a place where inshallah in the middle of this blessed month, and with this inshallah blessed Muslim company, and breathing the perfumed air of the memory of the great Imam, we can inshallah achieve more than just writing notes for a few lectures and then sitting around in the sun and watching the clock. Inshallah we will make this a time of ibadah. The mosque is open at night for those who wish to use it. We should all have the intention of having a wird of Quran every day, inshallah, at least a juz. We should remember the additional supererogatory prayers, particularly Salat al-Duha, and generally make the masjid the focus not just of the lectures and the prayers, but of our entire existence here, inshallah, so that we truly benefit. This is the first lecture, so inshallah I intend to say a few things about why the Imam should have been of such enduring impact and significance, and to ask the perhaps obvious question of whether somebody who was ahead of the pack in his very distant medieval times, 9 centuries ago, should necessarily be the Muslim who we look to first when we try to articulate our faithful response to the obviously very different challenges of modernity. That is to say, are those factors which made him great in the late Abbasid period the same kind of factors which apply to us today? Or should we be looking for a different exemplar, a different lens through which to view the prophetic heritage? It's a noted fact that even in the ranks of non-Muslims who pay more than a passing interest to Islamic civilization, that Imam al-Ghazali rahmatullahi alayh emerges as probably the most attractive figure from the scores, millions probably, of medieval scholars that our civilization produced. That on the groaning shelves of the manuscript libraries, which encompass the largest single body of pre-modern literature, no other civilization, even the Chinese, could compare with us for sheer intellectual productivity, that Imam al-Ghazali's works seem to leap out as being somehow significant and to speak to the contemporary condition. There are certain judgments that classical Islam made about who was best, who was most helpful, who was most religiously authentic, that still seem to be valid today. We respected Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, Qaddasallahu sirrahu, over all of our other classical poets, and he still seems to be the one who speaks to us in our time. And with Imam al-Ghazali rahmatullahi alayh, we find the Muslim intellectual as Montgomery Watt of Edinburgh University called him in the title of one of his books, to be somebody who does seem to have valuable insight to offer us in our rather different time, but bearing in mind the fact that certain constants in the human condition cannot change. The human physicality, the human mind is still the same human mind. We're still the same species, Homo sapiens, that we were then. And the list of vices and virtues is effectively constant in the ethical history of humanity. Let's just recall what makes Imam al-Ghazali himself, and that is his status as a seeker. And ours is an age in which people like to characterize themselves as seekers. Everybody is a seeker. Perhaps that's because nobody's actually found anything very much. Modernity is about an endless journey to a destination that nobody seems to think about. Does science have a final point? Does modern ethics have a final point beyond which there will be nothing? It's all somehow fashion. Fashion will never finally come to a conclusion as to what human beings should wear. It just changes and changes. And there's something about our modernity that is defined by endlessness. It just goes on, and it doesn't even operate in cycles frequently. It just is a process rather than a civilization as traditionally understood. And this has to do with the fact that modernity, unlike pre-modern civilizations, has never settled on a consensual definition of the good life, and has presumed, without being able to offer any evidence, and it can't because it's speaking about the future, of which it necessarily knows nothing and over which it has no control, that the golden age of humanity will be in the future rather than constituting something that existed in a sainted past. All pre-modern civilizations really assumed that there was an age of goodness in the past, the apostolic age, or the age of the church fathers in Christianity, the golden age in Hinduism, and we are now in the iron age, the age of darkness and the solidification of forms, the age of the great emperors in the Chinese legend, and the Yellow Emperor who began the entire process of dynastic history in China, the age of the Buddha, and for the Muslims, of course, the age of Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his Sahaba. These are the traditional narratives by which human civilizations have always measured themselves. There is a process of periodically interrupted and even partially reversible entropy that defines how we see ourselves in the timetable of history. We are going downhill, and that is, after all, what common sense suggests. After all, the natural movement of things is to go downhill. The nature of matter is entropic. But modernity, however, proposes something rather brave and rather strange, which is that it picks up presumably on a certain version of a particularly Christian idea of moving up towards a millennium, and universalizes that to propose the possibility of something resembling a utopia in this world, deliverable through human reason alone. And the 20th century's great political ideologies were largely the consequence, in very different ways, of that key assumption, which has its roots in the Enlightenment. That is to say that amongst nationalists, the assumption was that the future would be in the hands of the strong, so that the process of evolution, which they took to be anti-entropic, things seem to be moving towards more complex forms, and hence humanity, defined biologically as part of that, must be becoming better, and that has to define itself in the segments of humanity that natural selection favors, so the Aryan races will prevail. Others, however, thought that it was to do with something more universal and ethicizing, to do with a class struggle, and to do with a movement towards a classless and even cashless society, a kind of utopia of free individuals formed loosely and consensually into communes. None of those dreams survived when forced to deal with the realities of the world and human nature. And in fact, they turned, in every case, into nightmares. But it nonetheless is the case that our modernity, liberal secular modernity, the capitalist consumer society in which we all live, has maintained much of that presumption. That is to say, that the basic model of the world, in terms of matter, is towards dissolution. Eventually, the universe, we are told, will peter out with a few last red giant stars, and then there will be an equal distribution of energy across the cosmos, and everything will be in darkness. But on the biological level, the idea is that there is the emergence of species, the emergence of intelligence, the emergence of ethics, and hence we are, in some sense, genuinely capable of perfection. And this characteristically modern, strange idea derived from science, this illegitimate extension of the theory of natural selection into the human and into the social form, does dictate much of the assumptions of modernity. That is to say, there is progress. We have to be getting better. There must be more equality. There must be more rights. There must be more opportunity. There must be more choice. There must be more products. There must be more freedom. And on those definitions, the assumption is that things are indeed all moving without the absence of a mysterious metaphysical hand in the right direction, and that we are marching into a kingdom of light. The reality is, of course, that the religions, having millennia of wisdom on their side, are skeptical about any such project. Human beings may be improving in their techniques and in their ability to master the physical world and even their own biologies through genetic technology, which is now moving past the first faltering stages of adaptation and towards the possibility of real mastery over our physical forms. That with the concurrent development of technique and at the same time the static nature of the capacities of human consciousness and human intelligence, that there is an increasing mismatch, so that technique becomes more and more significant and our ethical lives struggle to keep up. Whenever there is a new piece of legislation planned, the mental equipment and the ethical register which we have to deal with the human implications of that transformation remain the same. And so we struggle, for instance, now with the idea of transhumanism. This is one of the big new philosophical debates in our civilization. To what extent is it ethical for us genetically to edit our species in order to remove hereditary diseases, for instance? Or to what extent is it ethical to edit our species in order to enhance the intelligence of our children or their longevity? All of these are possibilities in the laboratory now, and the ethics still struggles to catch up, because ethics is part of the human consciousness and it is a finite thing. It cannot be enhanced by science or by technology. So this is, in a sense, the paradox of our condition. Our tools are dragging us forward, but we are necessarily, as Homo sapiens, the same. Of course, some will argue that transhumanism will itself allow us to leave behind our status as Homo sapiens, and we will be able to adapt ourselves to be more intelligent, possibly more ethical. But that remains in the realm of science fiction. So this is our strange reality, and it would certainly have looked very strange to Imam Ghazali and to those in his time. But let's just move back in time. Imagine that we're in H.G. Wells's time machine and we've set the dial for the 5th century of the Islamic calendar, and we emerge blinking into the strong sunlight of Baghdad as Imam al-Ghazali is teaching and looking around at a world very different from our own. The possibilities of consumerism are there. It's a mercantile society. Baghdad is the city of Sinbad the Sailor and the 1001 Nights. It's a materially brilliant civilization. The Silk Road is taking people and goods and finance all the way to China. There is commerce with Byzantium, commerce with Egypt, commerce with India. It's the center of the world. It is the world's economic core. It is the center of the world's first effective globalization, which was that brought about by Islamic civilization. Imam al-Ghazali is right there. So we might want to ask ourselves the question as to whether he is a useful figure for ourselves because he is somebody who is already in the midst of globalization. He's in the most cosmopolitan city in the world. Baghdad has Christians, it has Jews, it has Zoroastrians, it has Buddhists, it has atheists, it has Neoplatonists, it has magicians, it has Hanbalis. Everything you could imagine is there already. Is that a prefiguring of our current multicultural cosmopolitan existence? Is he a useful religious thinker for those who live in religiously plural environments? There may well turn out to be some mileage in that. Similarly, Imam al-Ghazali is living in a time when there is a set of very complex arguments underway between proponents of aql and proponents of naql. That is to say, mind and revealed knowledge. Now, the Orientalist heritage, which has defined the way in which we see so much of Imam al-Ghazali, has tended to overstress that. Because Orientalism itself is based in a certain 18th century turn in German scholarship that liked to see theology as something of the past, rooted in superstitious, non-publicly verifiable truth claims, and that therefore there is always a tension between aql and naql, between what the mind can determine through its unaided operations and through what an alleged or real revelatory heritage can supply. And this has again been a key feature of our modernity, the idea that there's a trade-off, a zero-sum game, a tension, even a war between reason and revelation. And much, one might even say most, of Western disquisitions on the writings of Imam al-Ghazali has tended to situate him on that imaginary battleground. However, it is the case that more recent scholarship on Imam al-Ghazali has moved beyond that rather simplistic Enlightenment idea, the idea that the mind can take us forward away from medieval superstition and into a zone of reason and human consummation. That has, perhaps partly because of the catastrophes brought about by intellectualizing atheistic ideologies in the 20th century, there is a certain crisis of consciousness related to our postmodern condition that's a little bit cynical and skeptical about the capacity of the mind, unaided, to discern ethical truth. We're not sure whether there can be such a thing, ultimately, even as a secular ethic. John Gray, the philosopher at the London School of Economics, recently published a book called Straw Dogs, in which he, as an atheist philosopher, argues against the possibility that there can really be a coherent secular ethic. What we're living in is the afterglow of the Christian Middle Ages, internalized by Kant, but ultimately still rooted in that which is beyond the capacity of reason to know. Ethics come from elsewhere. Kant struggled with this. He found it to be a certainty within himself, the moral law within himself. And he was convinced that it was ultimately a sign of transcendence. But from the modern scientific perspective, ethics are simply something that human societies conjure up in order better to improve their chances of survival. They're not intrinsic, they're merely pragmatic. So we're living in that peculiar time when indeed there is a tension. This is the current culture war between Richard Dawkins and Alistair McGrath, and those battles which are being fought very virulently nowadays on a rather strange playing field where science is infinitely more capable in developing techniques than it was in the Middle Ages. In the time of Imam al-Ghazali, for instance, is using the books of Avicenna and the physics of Avicenna in particular, which denoted a pre-modern cosmology, a pre-modern conception of the nature of matter and of causality. We've moved beyond that now. But the science still has no clue how to answer the most fundamental thing that Imam al-Ghazali was worried about, which was the nature of the self. All of this stuff in the cosmos, Aristotle saw particles interacting in a particular way. Einstein saw them interacting in a very different way. In a sense, it doesn't matter. What matters is the human subject that is engaged in those observations. Human beings do not change, but what is it? What is this percipient entity? What is this I, this self within myself that is perceiving, that is analyzing, that is seeking to understand, that is Aristotle, that is Einstein? What is that? And that, the mystery of consciousness, is something which modern science cannot even begin to answer. Recently, the BBC screened a science program on the nature of consciousness, and really, even though the presumably atheistic presenter did the best she could, and even at one point she had a human brain in front of her in the studio and was slicing it up with a knife, the reality is that the self, the I, the human subject, is too deep a mystery for them to have any scientific or mathematical way of encompassing. Because in a sense, it's not out there in the world which the scientist is looking at, it's the scientist himself, and hence in a different category of observation and proof. So here again, we find that there is a constant. Imam al-Ghazali, rahmatullahi alayhi, is very conscious of himself, and he engages in muraqabah to the ultimate degree, wondering what he is, analyzing his inner states. He is a psychologist par excellence. And the psychological and ethical depth of the Ihya is to a considerable extent the consequence of Imam al-Ghazali's own capacity for self-knowledge. To some extent, his knowledge of the egos, the souls, the selves, the spirits of his disciples and those whom he had encountered, he had a sharp eye, but primarily when we see Imam al-Ghazali engaging in a particularly nice ethical distinction or psychological insight in the Ihya, and inshallah we'll be moving through a few of these in the days to come, we find that it is the result of his self-knowledge. Here again, there seems to be a disparity between the past and the present. The French philosopher Foucault, in one of his seminars at the Sorbonne, spoke about spirituality in terms of the defining capacity of modernity to seek truth without having regard to self-knowledge. He said that the Western philosophical tradition began with the slogan that was written over the entrance at Delphi's oracle, "Know thyself," and pointed out that self-knowledge, self-scrutiny, some form of ritual and ethical purification was always regarded as the first step in any traditional religious or mystical or philosophical system, except nowadays, when the idea of self-purgation, reflection, self-knowledge, ethical excellence as a precondition for enrolling in a philosophy degree in a Western university is kind of unimaginable. The modern mind is detached from its ethical context. One recalls Bertrand Russell trying to seduce women well into his 80s. There's a disconnection. The traditional model was human excellence, and hence a disciplined and luminous soul which could then do philosophy. The modern idea has no notion of that and assumes that if you can write a brilliant monograph on causality, then it doesn't matter what a mess your personal life might be. And this, again, is something that Foucault identifies as one of the key features of modernity. The lack of a propedeutic, the lack of a prologue of self-correction, self-knowledge. And this, again, it seems, is something that Imam al-Ghazali has a lot to tell us about. Because he was somebody who was looking out on an intellectual world, particularly in Baghdad, a rich city, a city where a lot of people had leisure, a city of great libraries, a city of translation, where the Greek legacy was very much a force to be reckoned with. Now, we need to set aside the Orientalist idea that the Greek legacy is about reason, ratio in some simplistic way, because the ancient Greeks themselves did believe in a supernatural realm. They were primarily metaphysicians. They did believe in a non-material soul. They did believe, although not in the monotheistic way, in personal survival after death. Their world was much closer to the world of faith than to the world of contemporary atheistic science and reason, for reason's sake. But still, it was a world that was challenging many. We need to remember that Imam al-Ghazali was a man of passion and of polemic. He was concerned with his own salvation, but he was also a person who felt immense empathy for the Ummah. No doubt something that was grounded in his early training as a jurist and in his own experience of the political instabilities of the time and the subversion of the Sunni political order by the Ismailis. To understand his unease about his age, on the face of it, a brilliant golden age, Baghdad, the biggest city in the world, the Muslims regnant east and west, no significant threats on the horizon. Even the Crusaders hadn't really made themselves felt yet, and they were a local phenomenon. The Mongols aren't going to turn up for a long time. This is truly a golden age. But still, his soul-searching had to do with an awareness that politically the Islamic world was in a state of severe fracture and subversion. The Ismaili movement, which was politically enthroned in Cairo thanks to the Fatimid dynasty. They're the ones who established, really, the University of Al-Azhar. Had fractured into two. One of the sides of the Ismailis remained in a fairly cautious and politically conservative relationship to the Fatimid caliphs in Cairo. But the others were free radicals, rooted in bunkers or castles in inaccessible corners of the Iranian plateau for the most part, and some in Syria, whence they would sally forth intellectually and, as it were, terroristically in order to subvert Sunni Islam. And Imam al-Ghazali was concerned with the terroristical side of Ismaili operations because some of his colleagues and even his patron, the Seljuk Wazir Nizam al-Mulk, were actually assassinated by the Ismailis in their suicide operations. But his real concern was with their da'wah. Why was it that Muslims should subscribe to this strange idea? Well, he recognized the force of their argument. In a time of confusion and turmoil, when there are so many different, even Sunni perceptions, when Baghdad is surrounded by 12 Shi'i countryside, where you have Neoplatonist speculations on all hands, where you have the Mu'tazilite movement, still significant because Nizam al-Mulk's predecessor, the Wazir al-Kunduri, had himself been a Hanafi Mu'tazili. This world of conflicting arguments, confusion, perhaps again something that reminds us of our present situation, was addressed by the Ismailis with the simple claim that if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Arhamar Rahimin, the most merciful of the merciful, then he cannot have left his ummah, the ummah of the chosen one, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, without guidance. It's inconceivable. And therefore there must be a marja. There must be somebody for whom our taqleed is not only possible but obligatory. And that is the boundary between true Islam and the mess of the competing sects. So there has to be an infallible imam and a living imam of the age to whom all the Muslims must be invited. And anybody who obstructs that is standing in the way of the light and must be physically eliminated. And this idea, this simple idea, which was rooted in certain movements in Aristotelian logic, the Ismailis liked logic, and they tried to prove logically that it was necessary that there should be an Imam of the age, was a real threat, and probably one that worried Imam al-Ghazali more than the threat which we more often hear about, which was the threat from Arab philosophy. But that latter threat still was substantial, and although some of Ghazali's books are written in refutation of the Ismailis, his book Fada'ih al-Batiniyah, the scandals of the Batinites are these esoteric, non-Fatimid Ismailis, and his book Al-Qistas al-Mustaqim, in which characteristically he seeks to use the weapon of logic in order to deflate the claims of the Imamites or the Ta'alimites. There is also the question of the Arab philosophers who in some ways, in some circles, are actually connected, usually through Neoplatonism, to the Ismailis. Now, it's very important that we understand this correctly, because the issue of the relationship between reason and revelation is a really important one. We find in the Quran a doctrine of radical and really unmediated revelation. That the Holy Quran is the integral, uncreated even, speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it contains directives which are the basis for the Muslim moral and religious life. But on the other hand, the Quran unmistakably, and here I think we can say that it's almost unique amongst world scriptures, contains injunctions to use the mind. لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَعْقِلُونَ أُولُو الْأَلْبَابِ. Phrases that clearly indicate the reasoning faculty in human beings. إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ لَآيَاتٍ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. In the way that the heavens and the earth have been created, and the succession of night and day are signs for people of understanding. الذين يذكرون الله قياما وقعودا وعلى جنوبهم ويتفكرون في خلق السماوات والأرض. Those who remember Allah standing, sitting and on their sides, and think about the way in which the heavens and the earth have been created. Again and again we find the Quran urging its initial hearers, the Quraysh, to use their minds, to think. You don't find that in, say, the New Testament. You don't find that in the Diamond Sutra of the Buddhists. It's something that does seem to be an important part of Islam's self-understanding at its initial moment. So on the one hand, knowledge decisively given through tawqif, in revelation. But on the other hand, that same revelation urges us again and again, it's clearly important, to use our minds. So the question then arises as to whether the mind can work things out without revelation, or whether the function of the mind, aql, is simply to try and understand things better that have been stated in revelation. And the famous early conflicts between the Mu'tazilites and the Ash'arites to some extent are the result of that almost inevitable argument. What is reason for? It's important, but if it can work everything out, then why should revelation have come in the first place? Now, it's in the context of that that the enormous influence of Greek philosophy makes its impact felt. Because the ancient Greeks, although they believed in the one, the good, and they were very big on ethics, and their ethical system is, in many ways, a towering achievement, they didn't have a doctrine of revelation. They had ideas of inspiration. You could be inspired in a dream. And indeed, the idea of the imaginative faculty in human beings as a point of reliable access to the transcendent world is an important principle, particularly in Plato. It comes up in some of his early dialogues. but no idea of a religious revealed text. This is something that is Semitic, Mosaic. So the Greek heritage emerges in Islamic civilization and finds its way into it in ways that continue to shape the standard curriculum of the madrasas to this day, particularly in things such as logic, in the context of an argument that was a little bit uncomfortable. To what extent could one learn from the ancient Greeks if they thought that they had nothing to learn from revelation? Wasn't that the opposite of what a Muslim should be looking for? Why learn from those ancient Greeks who, after all, in their personal religious lives were worshipping Saturn and Jupiter and Dionysus and something that looked more like the paganism of ancient Arabia than Abrahamic Tawheed? And thus began an argument that was resolved ultimately in a characteristically Islamic and very beautiful way in our civilization, which is that just as the Sirat Mustaqim urged by the Fatiha means that we differentiate when we look at the Ahl al-Kitab. So we say of the Ahl al-Kitab, okay, they've done many wrong things, لا تغلوا في دينكم, do not go to excess in your religion, انتهوا خير لكم, cease, it is better for you, don't say 3. Still, ليسوا سواء, they are not the same, they are not equal. من أهل الكتاب أمة قائمة يتلون آيات الله آناء الليل, etc. They are not the same. Part of the genius of Quranic revelation is that on the one hand it has this strong emphasis on truth and falsehood. جاء الحق وزهق الباطل. The truth has come, falsehood has fled away. Nothing could be more emphatic in its insistence on the unique value of truth than the text of Al-Quran al-Karim. But on the other hand, it does not lump those who are from another perspective into a single, essentialized, reified camp. ليسوا سواء. They are not all the same. It differentiates between good Ahl al-Kitab and bad Ahl al-Kitab. Similarly, with the intellectual legacy of ancient Greece, there were some Muslims, including some on the Hanbali wing of things, who thought, well, the Holy Prophet ﷺ didn't use syllogisms, so we shouldn't. Logic must be haram, because the Sahaba didn't do logic. We don't need it. مَا فَرَّطْنَا فِي الْكِتَابِ مِنْ شَيْءٍ. The Quran says we've left nothing out of the book. So why on earth look to those pagan Greeks? And again, fast forward to our contemporary situation, when we look at modern thought, modern ideas, there are certain amongst us, particularly some of our Salafi brethren, who would say, the Quran is complete, why borrow from anything else? That has always been a perspective, but it is no coincidence that it's always been a minority perspective. That is not where most of the Ummah historically has gone. Literalism of the Hanbali type, I speak of certain types of Hanbalism, has always been the smallest choice for Sunni fuqaha. It's the smallest of the 4 madhabs. It's the smallest of the schools of Aqidah. A certain type of non-Muslim polemic would say that has to be what Islam is. It's just Semitic literalism. But in fact, that is not where we have gone for the most part. That is not where our minds, consciences, hearts have chosen to inhabit. So there has been that perspective. And the Mu'tazilite movement to some extent emerges as a kind of reaction against that, worrying what happens when you deal literally with some of the verses in the Quran that says Allah istawa ala al-arsh, settled upon his throne, that he has a hand, yadullahi fawqa aydihim, and so on, that he has a face. What does it mean to interpret those literally? A literal interpretation has to be a physical interpretation. Does that mean that Allah has physical form? Is he therefore finite? That's the Mormon belief. Mormons believe that God has a physical form. is a particular height, and he looks a particular way, and he has long golden hair, and he flies around the universe at incredible speeds. That's a literalist reading of some of those biblical anthropomorphisms. But of course, most religious believers aren't going to go there. So there has to be some interpretation. The interpretation has to be based on reason. Where else are you going to get interpretation from? Interpretation is a rational act. So it was evident to the great majority of the scholars in early Islam that a straightforward literalism, naql and no aql, was not the way forward for the ummah, and it would lead to the absurdities of the Mormon God if you took it too seriously, or an audible creak as God sits on the throne. That is maybe something that a 4-year-old might imagine to be true of the deity, but it's not coherent. So the tradition of using the mind certainly predates the introduction of the Greek legacy into our civilization, because it's in the Quran that haply they may reflect, لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَفَكَّرُونَ, and because it's necessary if you're going to really and responsibly interpret the descriptions of deity given in Revelation. But what happened when the Caliph al-Ma'mun created his academy, his Bayt al-Hikmah in Baghdad in the glory days of the early Abbasid period, was that an immense amount of stuff was now being translated into rather good and attractive Arabic, including almost all of Aristotle and much of Plato, apparently not the Republic, but most of Plato's dialogues, and a lot of other things as well. And suddenly, in the bookshops of Baghdad, you had, as well as books of hadith and books of tafsir, you had the Nicomachean Ethics in rather nice Arabic, and if you have a mind, it's interesting stuff. So to understand the historic development of Islamic civilization, to understand why the textbooks in the madrasas to this day look the way they do, you have to understand that period and the way in which this Quranic dictum of laysu sawa, they're not all the same, was applied to the way in which the Muslims should deal with the Greek heritage. And Imam Ghazali is the one who explains this process of filtration better than anybody. It's already been going on in Sunni circles, and certainly his own teacher, Imam al-Haramain Abu Ma'ali al-Juwayni, who was his great teacher in Kalam and in Fiqh in Nishapur, wrote the great Kitab al-Burhan, wrote the Kitab al-Irshad, some great works of what we nowadays describe as philosophical theology, which incorporate significant patterns of thought, particularly from Aristotle, into an Islamic matrix. And Imam al-Ghazali, in his autobiography, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, explains what's going on here. He quotes the hadith, Al-Hikmatu dalatul mu'min. Wisdom is the lost animal of the believer. Wherever he finds it, he has the most right to it. Something like mathematics, or meteorology, or physics, or logic, or certain terms in metaphysics developed by the ancient Greeks. It doesn't ultimately matter who developed them if they're useful for the deen. If it's useful to have logic, because you can then do things with fiqh that you couldn't do before more precisely, then you incorporate them. But it has to be done by an expert, because that tradition is complex and could be misunderstood, and is, in many of its underlying assumptions, not monotheistic, as Muslims would understand it. So he says that just as the skilled money changer, sitting in the bazaar, can put his hand into a bag of coins and tell what's real gold from what is a forgery, so also the real scholar of Islam, looking at a non-Muslim heritage, has so much knowledge and wisdom and firasa, inward sight, that he can tell what's valuable for the Muslims and what isn't. And this indeed is what he does. So he writes a number of books, and we still haven't quite got our head around what exactly he's doing with some of them, but it seems that the earliest is his Maqasid al-Falasifa, the intentions of the philosophers. which is essentially a paraphrase of one of the great works of Abu Ali ibn Sina, called the Danishname Ala'i, which was written for one of Ibn Sina's patrons as a kind of quite extended compendium of the amalgam of Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy that had been absorbed into the region by the time the Arab conquest took place. And Imam al-Ghazali is shortening this and turning it into a kind of manual, and actually it's a very brilliant manual, and it's translated into Latin by somebody called Dominicus Giundisalvi, and it becomes taught throughout the medieval Christian world. Here in Spain and in Italy, even in England, Ghazali's texts are being used, but essentially he's understood as being somebody who's following the system of Ibn Sina, of Avicenna, because essentially that's what this is. It's just a summary of the Danishname Ala'i in a particularly crisp Arabic. But that's not the whole story. Now, it used to be thought that the Maqasid al-Falasifa was a kind of introduction or a sort of statement of the works of the philosophers that Imam al-Ghazali would then treat as a target in his critique of them. But if you actually look at the Maqasid and you look at the critique, which is his book Tahafut al-Falasifa, you see that actually they don't match very well. And he takes certain positions in one that isn't really refuted by the other. It's not really a kind of Aunt Sally, which he's then going to attack. So whatever the relationship of the books might be, Imam al-Ghazali writes what, certainly in terms of Western historians of philosophy, is his most significant book, which is his Tahafut al-Falasifa, which means the incoherence or the internal contradiction of the Falasifa, by whom he really means Ibn Sina. There have been earlier Falasifa. Al-Kindi was the first well-known one, and then Al-Farabi. Al-Kindi, more or less in the Mu'tazilite camp, more or less a member of the ulama, recognizably Islamic in his worldview, quite selective in what he's borrowing. Al-Farabi, who brings in a lot more of Plato, adopts a system that is troubling to the ulama, because, for instance, Plato doesn't believe that the world is created. He says the world has always existed. It's a necessary emanation of the nature of God, because God's being is so superabundant, replete, overflowing. His perfection has to overflow into what is not him, that therefore the world must always have existed. And so from that perspective, the Platonic perspective, there's no creation. So that was already scandalous in the eyes of the ulama, because Allah is Khaliqu kulli shay, the creator of all things. But what we're not getting, even in Farabi's time, is the sense that this is reason against revelation, aql against naql. Instead, it's two profoundly religious worldviews, in this case the Platonic and the Kalam worldview, colliding. Now, Imam al-Ghazali in his Tahafut is largely aiming at Ibn Sina, and a number of Muslim scholars, most recently Yahya Michel, have written about the Avicennan pandemic, like a sudden plague that takes over in the Islamic world when Avicenna writes and in ways that are extremely attractive and very brilliant and very persuasive, that seem to reconcile the differences between Plato and Aristotle and create a complete worldview that's also recognizable in Islamic worldview. Ibn Sina regarded himself as Muslim and used to go to the mosque to pray for guidance when he couldn't work out a philosophical problem, wayward in many aspects of his life, but still a member of the Ummah of Islam as he understood it. And this very brilliant system was subversive, and Imam al-Ghazali, again with his concern for the Ummah, was anxious about the spread of this system. And particularly his greatest, Ibn Sina's greatest work, Kitab al-Shifa, the metaphysical sections from the Shifa. And so, in this book, Imam al-Ghazali, just as he has been worried by the Ismailis and refutes them using logic, he refutes some of the positions of some of the philosophers. He doesn't say he's refuting the philosophers. He doesn't say he's against the philosophy altogether. He says very clearly in his introduction he's against the positions that some of them have adopted. And the book takes the form of 20 chapters, in each of which he develops his critique of a particular view of the Arab philosophers. And his preferred style of exposition is not simply to knock them on the head with a well-chosen ayah from the Qur'an, because these are people who believe that the Qur'an is to be interpreted on the basis of reason. Reason is objective, and if the Qur'an doesn't work for us, we have to reinterpret it until it does. They believe in asalat al-aql, the first principle is reason, then comes revelation. So you can't use a Qur'anic dalil against them. Instead, you have to beat them at their own game by using reason. You have to use this big technique, ultimately from Aristotle, that Imam al-Ghazali calls burhan. And each of these 20 chapters is a very subtle, difficult collocation of arguments, sometimes several arguments in a single chapter. And he says that on 17 of these issues, you have to call them mubtadi'. They're involved in heretical innovation. But on 3 issues, wajib takfiruhum, we have to consider them to be non-Muslims. And these 3 issues are, as with Farabi, the uncreatedness of the world, and then the corollary of that, which is that the world must go on forever. So there isn't really the possibility for at the end of time and the last judgment and heaven and hell. The world continues to be the emanation of the divine forever. And the third of these masail was God's knowledge of particulars. And this comes originally from Plato. Plato thought that the one, God if you like, in order to be internally undifferentiated and perfect, can't have within himself the knowledge of all of the little things in the world, because that would divide him up in some way. And therefore, in his internal simplicity, there is no knowledge of the details that happen in the world. And of course this doesn't square with the God of the Qur'an, and therefore Imam al-Ghazali says if you follow that, and Ibn Sina does seem to follow that, then you cannot be considered to be a Muslim, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Allamul Ghuyub, He is Al-Alim, Allah is the knower, Al-Latif, Al-Khabir, the subtle, the all-aware. You can't, however much you want to stretch things, make that coincide with the Platonic idea of a God who doesn't even will the world to come into being. He's just there, emanating, not really knowing anything. That's a bridge, that's a gulf that cannot be bridged. So he produces this book, which probably is one of the greatest monuments of human intellectual history. It's quite brilliant. It doesn't really have a precedent, particularly in the ulama's literature, arguing against the falasifa. And what's significant about it is the way in which it demonstrates that by this time in our theology, using reason, using logic, using things like essence, attribute, substance, all of these Aristotelian categories is fine. It's not a problem. If it helps you to come to grips with the debate and win the debate on behalf of Sunni Islam, where other methods will not succeed, then it even becomes obligatory to do this. So subsequently in our history, and this follows really from Juwayni, from Ghazali, and particularly from Fakhruddin Razi, who comes a couple of generations later, and writes those books which then become the basis for the madrasa text that he used to this day. Al-Muhassal, one of his great summary works of Kalam, becomes the basis for almost all of the later Kalam works, Taftazani and the commentaries. That we find that it's this willingness of the Ummah to say, Laysu sawa, they're not all the same, that has allowed us to learn from these principles of rationality and to find ways in which they can be used to vindicate rather than sideline revelation. And that's the genius of Imam al-Ghazali. If you read his books, you find 100% a passionate Muslim thinker. This isn't somebody who's trying to please the masses, but he has his own private philosophical hobby. Certainly not. There were people like that, but not Imam al-Ghazali. Every page of the Ihya is absolutely packed with sincerity. Now, one of the things that the Imam does in the Tahafut, in this, and it was really hugely important for our civilization text, is he asks why it is that some people are attracted to certain ideas rather than others. And this is something nowadays philosophers would call it theory choice. If there is what Muslims traditionally refer to as takaful al-adillah, there's kind of arguments in favor of something, arguments against something. It's all finely balanced. Generally, great intellectual arguments that last for centuries are finely balanced. If they weren't, they wouldn't last for centuries. Free will, predestination, creation, emanation, causality, non-causality. Is evil intrinsic, or is evil something that is just a cultural construction or determined by revelation? These go on for a very long time because they're subtle and they're difficult. And Imam al-Ghazali has some very interesting reflections on why people should reach for certain interpretations rather than others. And this again, I think, has tremendous contemporary relevance. If you read Richard Dawkins and then you read Alistair McGrath or whoever, and you try to see what's the balance, you're trying to be fair-minded and objective. Imam al-Ghazali would say that invariably in such cases people are swayed by what they wish to believe and therefore by the state of their souls. The ego is very big in informing people's philosophical choices, and that nowadays is likely to be particularly the case where there's no inauguration into philosophy through self-discipline, as there was, say, in the philosophical schools at Athens and Alexandria. There was an initiation and certain practices and certain ways of self-discipline, which included things like sports. You had to be an integrated, balanced, disciplined person. That's all gone now. Imam al-Ghazali spends some time in the Tahafut talking about the egos of those who are following Avicenna's system. He says they're really intoxicated by the weird names of the ancient Greeks and of the funny jargon that they've invented. And this again rings true in the contemporary academic context. People think it's cool to use all kinds of fancy philosophical jargon. It makes them feel up to date. It makes them feel they're in with the in crowd. It makes them feel superior. It's the ego. And very often nowadays, when people opt for a particular worldview, for instance, a new atheism, by no means clear at all, rationally, that the physical constants in the universe that determine the rules whereby a proton spins around the nucleus of every single atom in the world at a particular velocity, and it's not too fast or it would disintegrate, it's not too low or it would collapse. All these finely tuned physical constants, by no means clear that such a finely tuned universe could just have popped into existence from primeval nothingness. It's not an obvious, logical, rational assumption to make. But in the context of the rampant modern ego that wishes to be, in a Promethean way, independent of tradition and religion, it is kind of cool to believe that. It is an ego trip, because after all, it's the nafs that wants to be independent. Innal insana la yatgha an ra'ahu istaghna. Human beings transgress the bounds. They wish to see themselves independent. This is the Iblis that refused the commandment to bow down to Adam alayhi salam. Ana khayrun min, I am better than you. And he comes up with his own philosophical justification. Oh, you created him of clay, you created me of fire. So he produces a syllogism, and his theory choice is in favor of reason rather than revelation, even though revelation is taking place in front of him. He's being commanded by God himself, who's present, but still his ego says, istakbar, he's proud, and therefore he descends, he falls, and that's the beginning of it. And Imam al-Ghazali and Rumi also make something of this story. Reason, of course, a divine gift, and it's what makes us better than the cows in the fields, but reason, when employed by an unrefined ego, is a catastrophe. And that's the beginning of the story of the fall and of the human predicament. Before the garden, the fruit, all of that, there is the fall of Iblis. And why does he fall? Because of this use of reason, because of this logic, this syllogism that is cracking, because of his aba wastakbara. He refused and was proud. The Quran itself is subtly diagnosing this fundamental problem with rationality and philosophy. It's saying it's the ego tends to use it. It's not some kind of neutral thing in midair. It's pushed along by the one who's doing the reasoning, and very often the one who's pushing it along is a big ego. Particularly if he's a modern philosophy professor, they tend to have egos the size of planets very often. How are they going to make balanced choices? Inevitably they go for what is cool, what is fashionable, the latest intellectual fashion, what looks good on the pages of the best journals. Their egos crave that, and therefore their theory choice tends to follow. And Imam al-Ghazali in his Tahafut says, well, look at all these people, these young Muslims nowadays who are intoxicated by this terminology in Greek philosophy. It's the ego. And that's where the Ihya comes in. Because the Ihya really is Imam al-Ghazali's explanation of how you have to sort yourself out before you can be making any of those choices. You have to do all of this before you can get into this stuff of who's right and Plotinus and Aristotle and all of that. Before you venture into those very difficult areas of takafu al-adilla, make sure that the I, the self, that is moving your use of reason is under control. Paradisal rather than infernal, angelic rather than diabolical. And I think it's important to recognize this. Imam al-Ghazali recognized the point that the Ismailis were making, that others were making, was that there's takafu al-adilla. It's hard, the arguments go on. Do we really have free will? Or is that getting in the way of the divine omnipotence? These are finely balanced, difficult issues. The Ismailis thought you could resolve them just by saying, follow the infallible Imam, he'll tell you what's right. Imam al-Ghazali is saying, we don't believe in infallible Imams. There's so many rival Imams, who knows which is the one to follow. But instead, what you need to do is activate the fitrah, overcome the ego, and then ponder the Quran and use reason, and then you'll come to this position which is the position of the consensus of the Sunni scholars anyway. And hence the closeness of the science of tasawwuf with Sunni Islam. Not with Mu'tazilite Islam, not really with Shi'i Islam, certainly not with Khariji Islam, but with Sunni Islam. Tasawwuf is a core discipline. Because the true and the non-egotistic reading of the Quran and the Hadith comes about when the ego is chained up. That's when we have a better understanding. Just as in Ramadan, we have a better understanding of Islam and we see its wisdom more because the sufidati shayateen, the shaitans, are chained up. And during the day, when we're not immediately thinking of another trip to the cafe, we're kind of detached. We see things more rationally, more objectively. The passions don't get in the way. So the Ihya al-Ulum is, you could say, Imam al-Ghazali's contribution most substantially to Islamic intellectuality, in that he says no intellectuality will work unless you have a nafs al-mutma'inna, the soul which is at peace. the reason which is within us, which is this extraordinary, miraculous thing that can make moral choices, that can determine things that could be possible about the divine nature, that can determine the nature of the law, that can do all of the extraordinary things human beings can do, all of that depends on the nature of the self. But the first thing we need to do is to make sure that the I, the self, the inmost human subject, is balanced and not in the grip of its lower possibilities. And he talks about this a lot. The Ihya is basically a book on spiritual psychology, but if you read the translation of the book of the Wonders of the Heart, Kitab Ajaib al-Qalb, you'll see the language that he uses of the human being as being like a kingdom, and the kingdom is assailed by enemies. And those enemies are the vices and the passions which wish to bring us down into a kind of base state, and might even want to take over from the king in the heart. But in order to defeat those enemies, we need junud, we need soldiers. And those soldiers are the virtues, those soldiers are self-discipline, the soldiers are knowledge. And with those soldiers we can defend ourselves and become integrated human beings who can then begin the process of becoming responsible and complete Muslims. So the Ihya, when you see that, you can see the nature of its internal structure. It begins with the book of knowledge. That's no coincidence. And it has a lot in it about the dangers of egotistic knowledge. Kitab Dhamm al-Ghurur, towards the end of the Ihya, is really important. A whole book condemning egotism in scholarship. And he'd seen this, and he'd experienced it in himself, of course. His spiritual crisis was not just about worrying whether he was showing off in his teaching and therefore would guide others to paradise, but himself would go to hell. But it was also a crisis in his human subjectivity. He thought, there's so much egotism in me, that how do I know I'm doing my philosophy and my kalam and my fiqh correctly? Because the interpretation is coming from a man of ego. So there was a kind of double crisis at that point. And then the book ends, of course, with Kitab Dhikr al-Maut, the book of remembrance of death, the obvious place to take it. But also a significant place in that where you hung out your colours in the intellectual and theological debates in his world tended to be the question of al-ma'ad. Ibn Sina had written on this, because ma'ad, when you talked about the place of return and what happens after death, you immediately had to unveil yourself as either a Neoplatonist or as a Quranic believer. You couldn't really combine the two in that. And so if you wish to come through the process of religious exploration to a place that is sound, and the place that is sound is the faithful understanding of the data about what happens after death supplied in Revelation, in the Quranic revelation, you have to go through all of these other things like tawbah and mahabba and rida and sabr. That's the way to get that. So the conclusion is on a point that is a kind of watchword for orthodoxy, and that's significant as well. So the Ihya Ulumuddin is Imam al-Ghazali's challenge to ourselves. He is saying, well, you can be like Iblis, or you can be like the angels. You can be like Muhammad, you can be like Abu Lahab, in some contingent relative way. You can be way up, you can be way down. Human beings are fi ahsani taqweem, thumma radadnahu asfala safilin. Human beings can be the noblest, the detached, selfless, hospitable, loving, beautiful human being is the finest thing in creation. But the human being who is the disgusting briber, the pimp, the mass murderer, the egotist, the selfish person, that's the lowest thing in creation, lower than anything you'll find in the animal world. And that's the spectrum of which human beings are capable. And if you want to go up rather than go down, which is important, you need to sort yourself out. Riyadatun nafs, disciplining the self. Tahdhibul akhlaq, refining the traits of character. Mu'alajat amrad al-qalb, curing the sicknesses of the heart. Sort that out, sort what's inwardly out, and your outward practice of religion will be sorted, because the ikhlas will ensure that you will be keen to know what's right and to practice it. And you'll be right with others as well in your mu'amala. And there's much in the Ihya which is about marriage, about travel, about business ethics. It's not just for people living in caves, far from it. It's a social mysticism. And that, of course, is the nature of the religion. Ad-dinu mu'amala, religion is in transaction, engagement with others. So he's saying if you take this journey, then you'll be able to begin to get your theology right. Then you'll be a self-aware, self-possessed, restrained, compassionate human being who can weigh alternative interpretations in something like an objective way. But if you're in the grip of your passions and your egotism, it's not going to work. So this is something that I think has been underestimated, and perhaps we'll stop at this point, in the work of Imam al-Ghazali, that he's not somebody who one day is writing a book on Shafi'i fiqh, and another day he's refuting the Christians, and then he has to go to the Ismailis and talks about the philosophers, and then he writes this book on Sufism. No, it's all really part of his development in his writings of an agenda to explain and to universalize his own internal journey. And for him, the process of inward purification is inseparable from the process of using the mind in order to understand. And that is why we cannot say in Islam that there's a tension between reason and revelation. Revelation is what gives us the self-knowledge that enables us to use reason correctly. You can't have reason just on its own. As Kant thought, there can be a pure reason, but it really collapses very quickly. And you can't have a definition of the human subject that can support it. But reason, similarly, helps and can defend revelation. If you're arguing against Ibn Sina or Richard Dawkins or the Ismaili Da'i of the time or whoever it might be, you can't just list a bunch of Quranic verses and hadiths, because they don't accept that. Reason is the universal language of human disputation, and that's why the Quran uses it. It uses reason to dispute with the pagan Arabs. It says, who created the heavens and the earth? Man khalaqa as-samawati wal ard la yaqulun Allah. They will certainly say Allah. And the Quran is in a state of disputation. And Rosalind Gwynn, who wrote a recent book on the Qur'an's arguments, identifies over 20 different types of logical structure in the Qur'an's arguments. It's a polemical book itself. It is using logic in order to overcome the incredulity of a pagan and a self-satisfied and egotistic world. In that world, you use reason because there's nothing else to reach for. So inshallah this has taken us some way into understanding the purpose of Imam al-Ghazali in his Ihya Ulumuddin. It's not just a pious manual that you can use for khutbahs that tells you how to be good, how not to tell lies, how to deal with your neighbors. It has a lot of that. Anthologically, it's very brilliant. It's like an encyclopedia of the Islamic virtues. But that's not really his purpose in writing the book. His real purpose in writing the book is to enable us to be balanced and intelligent and responsible human assessors of the world outside, including the world of reason and reason arguments. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshallah, to benefit us from these few days, and inshallah to inspire our hearts and to give us righteousness with one another in mu'amala, and inshallah to increase in knowledge of this deen and knowledge of Imam al-Ghazali, inshallah. Wal afwa minkum, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.